moment the transport shuttle breached the upper atmosphere of Grelvia, the cold began to seep through the hull, like a ghost pressing its fingers against the seams of the ship. The students inside sat in tense silence, suited in reinforced exoclothing, each species displaying some version of anxiety or confidence. Nora sat near the rear, her legs crossed, her gloved hands resting lightly on her thighs. She watched the ice-covered horizon through the narrow viewport as the ship began its descent. Swirling snow clouds obscured much of the terrain below, but she could make out jagged ridgelines and deep craters that appeared frozen in mid-course. Her breath fogged the inside of her visor. The ship touched down with a jarring thud, followed by the shriek of metal as landing gear protested against the brittle, shifting surface. The doors opened with a mechanical hiss, and an immediate gust of wind forced several students to stumble back. The wind carried microscopic shards of ice, sharp enough to strip exposed skin raw within seconds. Nora stepped forward calmly, her boots crunching in the crystallized snow, and she adjusted her scarf under the collar of her insulated suit. One of the alien students, a tall, blue-scaled Thalkari named Ormex, scoffed loudly as he passed her. His suit bore a crest of his clan and gleamed with embedded microtech. "Enjoy the cold, primitive," he muttered, his translator producing a crisp, condescending tone. Professor Javon, a 10-foot-tall insectoid from the Pexari Dominion, emerged last from the ship. His multi-lensed eyes glinted with approval as he took in the fierce landscape. He raised his voice above the wind, clicking his mandibles before speaking in Galactic Common. "You have 72 hours. Survive or fail. All off-world transmissions have been blocked. Tools will fail. Assistance is forbidden. This is not a test of gadgets, but of instincts. Let the frost test your species." He turned without another word and retreated into the ship, sealing the hatch behind him. The sound of the locking mechanism echoed through the frigid silence. The group of cadets, 20 in all, scattered quickly, most forming subgroups based on species. Bright-colored exosuits blinked and shimmered in the swirling winds as each team activated portable generators and tech-based survival shelters. Thin energy domes hummed to life around many of the groups. Nora watched them, expressionless, as she tightened her belt and slung a small pack across her back. Her own tech was basic. Standard-issue heating elements, a short-range signal lamp, and an emergency ration kit. She didn't activate anything. Not yet. By the second hour, the magnetic interference began. The sky shimmered with violent pulses of violet and green light, auroras twisted into knots by the planet's erratic magnetic fields. Equipment sputtered, dome shields blinked and collapsed. Heating coils overloaded and died with a pop of static. Nora watched as panic set in. The large lizard-like Glavari students tried to rebuild their collapsible shelters by digging into the ice, but their claws cracked from the temperature. A group of floating Ventari attempted to levitate above the storm layer, but were buffeted back to the ground by hurricane winds. Nora began walking in the opposite direction. She didn't look back at the chaos. Her boots left crisp impressions in the powder, and she walked with slow, deliberate steps, scanning the environment. Snow dunes gave way to more stable, compact ice. She tested the ground by stomping once, solid. Her breath came out in short bursts, and she counted them silently to measure her exertion. Every few minutes she paused to kneel and press her gloved hand into the snow, feeling for layers, listening for the subtle creak of compressed strata beneath the surface. When she found a spot with just the right consistency, light snow atop dense compacted ice, she set down her pack and knelt fully. The wind stung her cheeks, and the ambient temperature, she estimated, hovered near 80 degrees C. She pulled a broken piece of alloy plating from her bag, originally torn from a malfunctioning drone back on the shuttle, and began carving a circular trench into the snow. The first hour passed as she dug, then another. She ignored the cold in her joints and the numbness in her fingers. She shaped each block of snow with precision, cutting them into curved wedges. She worked in a spiral, placing each block slightly tilted inward, building a dome from the base up. The wind whistled over the rising structure, but inside the half-completed shell it was quieter, insulated by layers of snow. Night fell in sudden darkness. Grilvaio rotated rapidly, and with it came colder air, the kind that turned even alien biosuits brittle. Nora lit a small chemical lamp and placed it in the center of her igloo, casting an amber glow. She tested the airflow using a strip of torn cloth, watching how the heat escaped. It didn't. Not yet. She smiled faintly. She used compacted volcanic ash, scavenged earlier from the snow, ejected from deep fissures in the planet's surface, to reinforce the outer shell. Then she took porous lava rocks, hollow in structure, and began constructing a chimney-like vent. These rocks had a unique property. They absorbed solar radiation and released heat slowly. Arranged properly, the vents would draw out smoke while cycling warm air downward. It was a crude thermal exchange system, but it worked on Earth. It would work here. Just before she sealed the last block above her head, she heard movement outside. Her hand froze, a thud, then a wheezing sound. She waited, alert. A figure staggered into view. Ormex, the same Thalkari who had mocked her earlier. His crest had cracked, and his suit's shoulder panel sparked feebly. His fingers dragged behind him in the snow, and his eyes, usually glowing green, were dim. He collapsed just outside her dome. Nora crawled forward, unlatched the bottom entrance flap, and dragged him inside. He didn't resist. His skin was dangerously pale, his breath shallow. She didn't speak. She wrapped him in a thermal blanket, removed the failing battery from his suit, and placed a warm stone against his chest. Then she turned back to her work, sealing the last opening of the igloo. Outside, the wind howled louder, shaking loose chunks of snow from nearby ridges. The sky erupted with pulsing arcs of electromagnetic light, dancing like spectral fire across the darkness. The campgrounds in the distance were no longer visible, buried in a growing wall of white. Inside her small dome, Nora sat cross-legged, breathing steadily, hands resting once again on her thighs. Ormex stirred in the corner, wrapped in warmth not from technology, but from a shape carved by human hands, born from millennia of primitive necessity and intuition. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, not in fear, but in quiet readiness. The cold had tested her, and she had answered. The second morning on Gralvia did not come with sunlight. The sky remained a matte curtain of gray ice haze, and the snowstorm had not subsided. Nora awoke to the muffled crackle of wind brushing against the igloo's outer wall. The interior air, though far from warm, was survivable. Her body was sore from the previous day's labor, but she moved deliberately, pushing herself upright and checking the small rock-based fire vent near the ceiling of the dome. A thin trail of smoke exited steadily through the channel she had built using stacked volcanic stones. The porous rocks still retained heat, radiating a faint but crucial warmth into the air. Across from her, Ormex stirred, his breath audible but steadier than the night before. His eyelids fluttered open, and confusion crossed his scaled face before recognition set in. He didn't speak, just looked at her for a long moment as she pulled on her gloves and secured the strap on her pack. She finally spoke, her voice low but firm. "The wind will only get worse by midday. If we want to survive longer, this dome won't be enough." She didn't wait for him to answer. She picked up the metal plate she used to carve ice blocks and crawled toward the igloo's small exit tunnel. Ormex watched her disappear into the brightness beyond. The wind outside had sharpened. Each gust carried enough force to knock her off balance if she wasn't careful. But the sky above had cleared slightly. She took that as a window, brief but usable. Visibility stretched across the frozen plain in blurred shapes. Scattered across the distant field were collapsed shelters, shattered by the night's storm. She spotted movement near a ridge. Another student struggling to stand, his suit visibly cracked, one arm pressed against his side. The figure stumbled and vanished behind a crest of ice. Nora memorized the direction, but didn't pursue yet. She turned her attention to the area surrounding her igloo, selecting a patch of compacted snow close by. She used her makeshift carving tool to test the depth and quality of the ice beneath the surface. Once satisfied, she began carving blocks in a spiral, repeating the method she had used the day before. Her muscles protested, but her mind remained focused. Behind her, Ormex emerged slowly, dragging himself through the tunnel with a groan. He wore only half of his suit now, having discarded the cracked upper plating. He clutched the side of the dome and squinted at her. "You're building another one?" he asked, voice raspy. She nodded. "One isn't enough. We'll need more if others find their way here. And if we link them, the heat can be shared." He watched her in silence, Then, without another word, he stepped forward and picked up a flat shard of ice, mimicking her motion as she shaped the snow. He was clumsy at first, unaccustomed to working without tools, but he didn't complain. The two worked together for an hour, then another. Block by block, the second igloo rose beside the first, and Nora paused only to realign her breathing and drink melted snow from a pouch warmed by stones. The second dome was larger than the first. Nora intended it as a central hub. She added a second entrance, designed as a low crawl-through to keep heat from escaping. The new chimney vent required more stones, so she set off in search of the distinctive ash-gray rocks that littered the outskirts of the snowfield. Ormex followed behind her now without hesitation. Near a small depression at the base of a cliff, she found what she needed: cracks in the icy earth where puffs of warm gas escaped. Geothermal fissures. They weren't large enough to inhabit, but the area nearby was rich in black porous stone, still faintly warm to the touch. She collected several with gloved hands, loading them into a cloth sling fashioned from the lining of her pack. As they returned to the construction site, the wind howled louder than before. A faint shape staggered into view from the snow ahead. A Ventari student, limbs barely intact, hovering erratically with blue blood leaking from a gash across his side. His vocalizer sparked weakly. "Help!" Nora rushed forward and grabbed his arm before he collapsed. His breathing was shallow and his eyes were dilated. She and Ormex dragged him to the new dome, laying him inside on the insulated base she had already prepared from compacted snow and spare thermal wraps. Ormex adjusted the vent stones while Nora pressed a heated rock pouch against the alien's chest. The Ventari's breathing steadied, but he didn't speak again for a while. Ormex sat beside him, staring at the snow ceiling. "He won't be the last," he said softly. Nora looked at him and nodded. "Exactly. That's why we're not stopping." She rose and stepped out once again. By dusk, they had completed 3 more domes, each one connected by low tunnels, forming a honeycomb structure that trapped and circulated heat. Inside, the ambient temperature stabilized around 95 DEC, thanks to the communal vent system and body warmth from the growing number of survivors. Every stone was placed with intent. Every igloo was reinforced using techniques she remembered from documentaries and forgotten Earth traditions. Nora's body was beyond exhausted. Her fingers were stiff, her shoulders ached, and her breathing came in short gasps, but she moved with determination, driven not by orders but by the urgent reality that no one else here had the skills or instincts to do what needed to be done. More students arrived through the night, a group of 3 Glamari, frost clinging to their antennas, a solitary human boy, weeping silently, clutching a broken comm device. Even a Zernian, usually proud and distant, collapsed without a word beside the central fire vent. Nora greeted each with brief eye contact, directing them with nods and gestures to the warmest spots inside. Ormex had stopped questioning her. He simply worked. The once barren ice plain now housed a living network, 7 interconnected domes, all born from the hands of a single girl who refused to freeze or flee. The glow of the central igloo lit up the sky like a faint beacon. Nora watched from the edge of the ring, her face streaked with cold sweat, her eyes sharp. The wind tried once more to tear through her coat, but she stood firm. The frost had taken so much from others. She wouldn't let it take one more. In the distance, lightning cracked through the sky, illuminating the ruined shapes of collapsed tech domes and shattered pride. But within the chain of igloos, heat pulsed like a heartbeat, strong, steady, and entirely human. And she knew the test wasn't over. But now, the others had a fighting chance. The third day began not with sound, but with a pressure change, an eerie stillness that settled across the frozen plains like a warning. Nora opened her eyes inside the central dome, her breath rising in pale spirals. She had slept only for minutes at a time, her body unwilling to fully shut down while responsibilities still pulled at her like a rope around her chest. Around her, the survivors slept, curled together, alien and human, blanketed in pooled body heat, thick fabric layers, and the retained warmth of fire vents. Her igloo network had become more than shelter. It had become the difference between death and breath. She stood quietly and moved toward the exit tunnel, her limbs heavy but steady. Crawling into the outer air, she met a strange calm. The storm had paused, but the silence was unnatural. the kind of silence that followed before the earth cracked or the sky split. The cold was still cruel, but something had changed in the air. Ormex met her gaze as he emerged behind her. He had taken on the rhythm of her movements, no longer hesitant or dismissive. His crest had partially healed, the damaged tech stripped from his armor, replaced with woven thermal wraps stitched crudely from salvaged material. He stepped beside her and spoke in a low voice. "The sky's wrong. The clouds. Too thin." She nodded. "Pressure drop. Something's coming." They both turned toward the west, where distant shadows stirred on the horizon. Snow rose in slow waves, but these weren't natural formations. The shape was too uniform. Nora squinted and saw what it was. An incoming shelf of translucent ice fog, carried not by wind but by gravitational pull. A cold front denser than anything before it, the kind Grelvia unleashed only once every few lunar cycles, the kind that suffocated the breath from lungs and dropped temperatures beyond what even her domes could withstand. She knew the igloos wouldn't survive unless she acted now. Without a word, she began pulling out the drawing slate she had carved into earlier, a slab of packed snow marked with melted lines and finger grooves. She examined the current dome network layout, then quickly traced 3 potential additions. She needed more airlocks, more venting, more insulation between the chambers. Fire alone wouldn't hold back what was coming. Ormex watched for a moment, then turned and summoned 2 of the other students, one Glimari with delicate purple skin, and a Zernian with thick armor plating. They gathered around Nora silently. She looked up, met their eyes, and spoke with calm authority. "We need to add an inner ring, secondary insulation domes. No one leaves. We scavenge only from nearby structures. We reinforce every tunnel. If one fails, the others will hold. It's the only way we outlast this." No one argued. The team split immediately. Nora led the reinforcement effort, starting with the oldest dome, her first. She carved a secondary layer around it, using denser snow and reinforcing it with volcanic ash and melted ice slurry. The mixture froze into a tough shell, thick and gray, absorbing the wind's bite. Inside, she worked with Ormex to dig trenches that funneled airflow through heated passageways, each lined with hollow stones to circulate warmth without trapping carbon. The other cadets began tearing apart the ruined exo-tents from the failed tech shelters nearby, dragging the composite fibers back across the frozen terrain. One of the students collapsed from exposure, but Nora had anticipated this. She had created a triage dome earlier in the morning, just in case, and now it served as a healing pod. The students worked with quiet urgency, every movement born from instinct, not training. While layering the last tunnel wall, Nora's glove tore open on a jagged chunk of ice. Blood welled from her knuckle and froze instantly on the surface. She hissed and pulled back, pressing the wound against her lips for warmth. Ormex noticed and stepped forward, offering a strip of cloth he had torn from his suit liner. She accepted it with a nod and wrapped the wound tightly. By midday, the sky dimmed further. The fog wall now covered nearly half the visible horizon, a thick, spectral blue wave crawling low, flattening shadows in its path. As it approached, the temperature dropped. Not by degrees, but in steep, violent plunges. The outermost igloo, a dome used for firewood and melted water storage, cracked along its arch. Nora was there in seconds, inspecting the split. She crouched, touched the line, and felt it groan beneath her fingers. She looked up. "Collapse is imminent. We isolate it and seal it off from the rest of the network." Ormex grabbed 2 students to help. Within minutes, they carved a makeshift ice wall in the tunnel, connecting the storage dome to the network, sealing it. Then Nora placed 2 heat-absorbing stones on either side to slow thermal loss through the barrier. As she returned to the center dome, the fog hit. It wasn't loud. It didn't roar or howl. It just arrived. A sheet of blue swallowing everything. Visibility dropped to a few meters. The igloos shook faintly under the pressure, like lungs exhaling under a frozen hand. The temperature plunged. Ice formed over Nora's eyebrows and eyelashes even inside the tunnel. Her breath stung her teeth. Inside the central dome, the survivors huddled tighter. The fire vent rocks glowed a dull red now, slowly releasing what little heat they had absorbed from earlier daylight. The air thinned slightly, and frost began forming along the edges of the vents. Nora realized the geothermal stones needed replacing, or they'd all suffocate. The vents would clog. She had only one place left to find more rocks beyond the ridge. She turned to Ormex. "Keep everyone in. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, collapse the outer passage. No waiting." He stood frozen, eyes wide. "You'll freeze out there." "I won't," she said. "But we all will, if I don't go." She didn't give him time to argue. She crawled out through the main entrance and was immediately swallowed by the fog. She kept her steps close to the ground, her breathing shallow to conserve warmth. The visibility was gone, but she had memorized the path. Her gloves were lined with ash to absorb the cold. Her face stung with every second. She reached the ridge by crawling. The volcanic stones were there, just beyond a mound of ice. She pulled 2 from the ground, then 3 more. Her arms trembled, but she didn't stop until her sling was full. She turned back, but something shifted beneath her. A soft rumble. A crack opened in the ice, sending a shudder through her spine. She bolted forward, stumbling as the fog thickened and the air thinned. Her vision blurred. The stone sling pulled at her shoulder, each step a scream in her legs. But the igloo entrance appeared like a ghost. Ormex's shadow was at the edge. He grabbed her arm and pulled her through, just as the wind turned violent again. Inside, she fell to her knees, coughing, her face ghost-white, fingertips blue. The others rushed to her, lifting the stones, placing them near the vents. The warmth returned gradually, creeping into the dome like dawn. She looked up as the air settled again. Her eyes met Ormex's. He didn't speak, but he saluted her, a gesture of warrior respect in his culture. Nora didn't return the salute, she just nodded once. She had made it back, and the dome still stood. The fog lingered for nearly an entire planetary rotation, casting the ice world in a frozen silence that felt almost sacred. Inside the central dome, warmth still pulsed through the stone-lined vents, soft and fragile like the last embers of a dying fire. Nora sat near the center with her legs folded beneath her, her eyes half closed, not asleep, but suspended somewhere between rest and readiness. Her limbs throbbed from the cold excursion, and the skin on her cheeks was cracked and raw beneath the protective balm she had applied. Still, she refused to collapse fully. She knew the moment she let go of awareness, everything she had built could begin to unravel. Ormex approached from the tunnel leading to Dome 6, his broad shoulders slightly hunched to avoid the low ceiling. He crouched beside her, his voice low and gravelly. "Fog's thinning. The sky's bleeding light again." She lifted her gaze and exhaled. "How many are stable?" 21, he replied. 2 still unconscious. One of the Glimari didn't make it through the night. Nora's jaw clenched. She didn't speak. She simply stood and moved toward the side tunnel. The quiet murmur of survivors echoed faintly as she passed through each dome. Blankets of thermal fabric were pressed against the walls. Small fire rock containers had been divided to ensure slow release of heat throughout the web of domes. Each chamber was occupied now. She had turned a snowfield into a functioning sanctuary with nothing but memory, will, and primitive engineering. She stopped at the second-to-last dome and knelt beside the unconscious Glimari student. The skin had darkened and his breathing was faint. She adjusted his wrap and moved one of the warp stones closer to his side. "He has a chance," she said softly. Ormex watched her and then looked away. "He has a chance because you gave him one." She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to a group of students seated near the water station, where meltwater was collected in carved channels and stored in repurposed ice crates. "We need more snow melt," she instructed, "and more ash to reinforce the main dome's east wall. It's beginning to bend from pressure." The students nodded and moved with purpose. There was no hesitation now. Even the proudest species had begun to take orders from her without question. Somewhere between her first igloo and the 12th, the hierarchy had shifted. Not through title or lineage, but through action. The fog began to lift by mid-rotation. Through the compacted tunnel window near Dome 4, Nora saw the hazy silhouette of the distant ridges. She narrowed her eyes and noticed movement, blurs in the whiteness that weren't caused by weather. She reached for the observational lens salvaged from a cracked visor and peered through it. Figures. 4? Maybe 5? Struggling? Heading in the wrong direction? She turned sharply. "Survivors!" "North Ridge. Someone needs to guide them in." Ormex stepped forward. "I'll go." She stared at him for a second. "You'll freeze if you go alone." "I'll take Javor with me," he said. "He's strong enough. and he owes you his life. We'll bring them back." She paused, then gave a single nod. "Take the red markers. Light the ridge behind you so I know you're still moving." Ormex disappeared through the tunnel, calling to Javor as he went. The rest of the students watched in silence. Nora stood tall in the center of the dome and addressed them all. "Reinforce the inner passages. Check every dome for structural fatigue. If we get more people, we'll need at least 2 new sleeping zones by nightfall." Without objection, the cadets got to work. A Ventari girl and a human boy began carving ice blocks from the outer layer of Dome 5. 2 Xernians started mixing ash slurry for reinforcements. A wave of movement passed through the network like muscle memory. As the hours passed, the rescue team's red beacon lights flickered steadily across the snow. Nora checked their position every 30 minutes. Her fingers were numb, but her mind stayed sharp. By the time the lights shifted direction and began curving back toward the dome cluster, she prepared a heated shelter zone and readied dry wraps. When Ormex returned, his arms were frozen up to the elbows and his breathing was harsh. Javor carried one of the rescued cadets over his shoulder. 2 others stumbled in with frost-crusted faces, barely aware of their surroundings. The last one, a young alien girl with gill-like slits along her neck, collapsed into Nora's arms before whispering, "We saw the fire." "We thought it was an illusion." "It was a signal," Nora said, wrapping her tightly. "And you followed it. That means you'll live." As the new arrivals were tended to, Ormex sat quietly near the wall, peeling ice from his armor. Nora knelt beside him. "Your hands still attached," he said with a faint smirk, "but I wouldn't turn down a hot stone." She handed him one without speaking, then rose again. Her back was aching and she hadn't eaten in hours, but she couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. The sun, or what passed for it on Grelovia, hovered low in the sky, casting long shadows of the domes across the snow. Nora stood at the center of the network and slowly turned in a circle, scanning the horizon. From above, her igloo system would have looked like a galaxy of stars stitched together by tunnels of ice. Each dome a life preserved, each tunnel a risk survived. She climbed a small hill behind the cluster, the snow crunching beneath her boots. As she stood at the top, she could finally see the entire structure. 13 domes now, woven into a spiral pattern, each connected, each heated, each filled with survivors who had once mocked her, dismissed her, or simply ignored her. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Her breath clouded before her, then vanished into the air. She wasn't done. There would be more. More storms, more damage, more lives dragged across the ice toward the hope she had built with her bare hands. But for now, this moment was hers. Nora turned back toward the domes. Her domes, her people, her system. Built not from dominance or power, but from grit, pattern, and purpose. The test was still ongoing, but she no longer felt like a student. By the time the sun of Grelvia curved low across the ice horizon for the final time in their test rotation, the Igloo network had doubled in size. From 13 domes it had grown to 20, connected in 2 wide spirals of protection, with a reinforced hub in the center. Nora stood near the edge of the furthest dome, her body covered in frost, her face pale from fatigue, but her eyes sharp with clarity. Her boots cracked with each step over the hardened snow. She hadn't slept in over 30 hours, not since the last expansion began. Her sense of time was blurred, measured only by the rhythm of movement, construction, recovery, and rescue. The final rescue came unexpectedly. A small craft had crash-landed several kilometers from the dome network, disoriented from Grelvia's magnetic interference. A human boy had stumbled into view during twilight, dragging a broken beacon with one hand and crying out hoarsely. She had sent Ormex and 2 others immediately, using a heated tether system they had designed earlier. Thick vines from the tundra trees melted and bound with ash and wrapped around lava stones, glowing faintly in the cold. The tether left a visible trail, a path home should the fog rise again. When the team returned with the final group of survivors, 4 alien cadets and 1 unconscious professor's assistant, it was clear that the test was ending. The assistant had a transponder embedded in his uniform. His arrival meant someone had been sent to observe the conclusion. But he wasn't awake to confirm it, so Nora kept moving. The air shifted again by the 6th hour of the final day. The silence and the wind meant only one thing. A craft was approaching. Not a storm, not a death front. A ship. Rescue. Nora stood on the outer ridge with Ormex and 2 other cadets. Javor and the Ventari girl, Selish. She had assigned them as watchers, scanning the skies from the peaks. And now, above the veil of fog, the soft whir of thrusters began to break through. A triangular ship descended slowly from the clouds, its lights blinking in gold and violet. The Pexari symbol gleamed on its underbelly, an insignia of interspecies education and elite survival training. Nora said nothing as the craft hovered, adjusted, then landed with a whispering hiss. When the hatch opened, a tall figure emerged. Professor Jevon descended the ramp with slow, deliberate steps. His insectoid form glimmered in the frozen light, and his multiple eyes scanned the scene without expression. He stopped before the edge of the dome network, tilting his head to observe the spiraled formation of ice and stone. Survivors stood silently near the entrances, alert but calm. There were no injuries visible, no signs of panic, just exhaustion and order. His mandibles clicked. "Step forward, human." Nora didn't flinch. She descended from the ridge and approached, her shoulders square, her coat tattered, her gloved hands resting loosely at her sides. She stopped 3 meters from him and looked directly into the cluster of eyes that studied her. "You are Nora Carter," he said, his translator humming softly. "Yes," she answered. "This trial was not intended for resolution by primitive construction or outdated planetary methods," he said. "And yet I find 20 ice domes, interconnected, vented, occupied, warm." She didn't speak. "Your species was given no advantage," he continued. "No atmospheric suits beyond standard issue. No survival protocols tailored for this environment. And yet, every cadet assigned to this field test who survived now resides within a structure designed and led by you." Still, she said nothing. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the domes. "Explain the logic." She met his eyes. "I didn't use logic. I used memory. Earth once had frozen places just like this. Humans built homes with nothing. I remembered and I acted." Professor Jevon clicked once. A sound that might have been amusement or disdain, she couldn't tell. No calculations, no commands, no theory. Just application. "Yes," she said. He paused, then stepped closer. "When I designed this exam, I intended for it to expose fragility. Species who lean on technology, who forget the core of survival. Yet none of your peers took control. Only you. And not with force, but with utility." He gestured to the igloos behind her. "Your hands created this, your will sustained it." She didn't reply. He clicked again, then lifted one long arm and extended it outward. "This test is concluded. Nora Carter, human cadet of Earth, you are hereby recognized as the highest performing individual in Gralvia Survival Sequence 9. Behind her, murmurs began to rise among the students. Some gasped, others looked down, ashamed, and some, Hormex among them, smiled quietly. Jevon continued. "All cadets will be extracted within 1 planetary hour. However, this structure will remain. Gralvia now has its first ground shelter site, and your design will be recorded in Interstellar Survival Doctrine." Nora blinked. He turned. "What is its name?" She looked at the spiral of snow, stone, and heat she had shaped with her fingers, and breath and pain. She thought of the first dome and the boy who nearly died. She thought of Ormex, dragging students through fog, of vent stones she had molded with bloodied gloves, of silence and snow and breath shared under death's shadow. She looked back at him and said, "Call it Ember Nest." Jevon paused. Then he nodded once. "So it shall be." He returned to the ship without ceremony. As the hatch lifted behind him, a group of medics emerged, dispersing among the cadets with blankets, thermal gear, and stim injectors. A Glamari girl cried softly as she was lifted into a support sled. Javor helped another cadet into the shuttle ramp, cradling him like a child. Nora stayed where she was. Ormex approached her quietly. His crest shimmered faintly under the ship's light. "You didn't just pass," he said. "You changed the test." She looked at him. "No. I just remembered who we are when things fall apart." He tilted his head. "Then maybe that's the part we all forgot." A moment passed between them. One of earned respect, not through blood or battle, but through the quiet architecture of survival. As the last students boarded the ship, Nora lingered at the edge of the domes. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through her hair. She turned to Embernest one last time and inhaled. The faint warmth of the firestones still hung in the air. The structures stood proud, clean and beautiful in their raw utility. She stepped onto the shuttle ramp without looking back. Grelvia's sky began to lighten as the engines roared to life. And beneath it, Embernest glowed faintly. Alive, carved into memory, fire beneath frost.